super excited about today's presentation titled 5 Good Reasons to Doubt Darwin. Now, as we've already mentioned several times, the premise of the whole series, 5 Good Reasons, is that God invites and enjoys inquiry. Come now, let us reason together. Isaiah chapter 1, verse 18. God is a God who invites us to come to the table, to pull up a chair, and to ask the hard questions. And today we're going to be asking some hard questions, right? We're going to be dealing with arguably the single most significant, in terms of its influence, the single most significant scientific idea in the history of mankind. Again, arguably. Others might argue for Newtonian physics or Einsteinian physics, but the theory of evolution is right up there with arguably the most saturative ideas in all of the world. And there are some hard questions that come with this idea of evolution. Are we the descendants? Are we the progress of an evolutionary process? Do we find ourselves as sort of advanced a mammalian species and there's more yet to come? What exactly is the truth about evolution, and how does it intersect with Scripture? And so today we're going to come and reason together a couple other passages that have been guiding passages for us in our series so far. Psalm 34, verse 8, "Oh, taste and see that the Lord is good." And there are many people around the world, many millions of people around the world, billions in fact, that name the name of Jesus, that would identify in some significant sense as Christian. People that have said, I want to taste and see that the Lord is good. But there are also a large number of people that say, I would like to engage in that faith journey, that faith transaction, but the obstacles are too great. It's too difficult for me intellectually and in terms of my education, and I can't make that leap of faith. What some regard as a leap and what I'm suggesting is a step. And so in John chapter 12, verse 32, Jesus says, when I am lifted up from the earth, I will draw all people to myself. I think the story of Jesus, as we have argued here, the story of Scripture, is a universally attractive story. It's an amazing story. In the words of Alvin Plantinga that I've quoted several times, we'll quote him yet again today, a little different. It's not only the greatest story ever told, it's the greatest story that ever could be told. And there are a great many people who will concede that. They will say, from a beauty perspective, from an intrigue perspective, from an aesthetic perspective, that's an amazing story, and I wish it were true. But probably you know people, and I certainly know people, for whom there are just too many obstacles, too many barriers, too many things that make it, from their mind, from their perspective, impossible to believe these things that they could almost wish were true. I wish it was true that there was a God and that He was good and that I could taste and see that He was good. I wish it was true that Jesus was the Son of God and that He came down to show us who and what God was and that He and His Father were one and that God looks like that. There's people that want these things to be true, but they feel that there are insuperable intellectual obstacles, and probably at the top of the list when it comes to those obstacles is the idea of evolution. Right, evolution. One of the other great obstacles, of course, is the existence of suffering, the ubiquity and proliferation of suffering in the world. And we'll spend 2 whole sessions on that later in the series. And so today we're going to look at 5 good reasons to doubt Darwin. Now, I want to just say right up front here, I am not a scientist, and so in many ways I am venturing somewhat outside of my depth here, and I freely admit that. As a pastor and as a reader and as a public speaker, I am not a professional scientist. However, I can say that I have read dozens and dozens of books about this subject, and I'm really passionate about it. And hoping that you will find something in here that will either help you to strengthen your existent faith or perhaps make faith in Jesus be more credible than it had been before. And so we're going to talk today about reasons to doubt Darwin. This is going to be, again, a bit of a bumpy ride, so prepare yourself for some big words, some big ideas. We're going to go back to science class for a few of these reasons, but I think on the whole, you're going to find the presentation persuasive, or at least I hope you do. Well, let's start with reason number 1. Reason number 1 is that evolutionary reductionism undermines identity, character, freedom, and so much more. Let's just pause right there for a moment. Some of you might already be thinking, David, when you say evolutionary reductionism, that's a lot of syllables. What do you mean by that? Well, of course, the root word of reductionism is to reduce, right? To reduce, to take something down to its most basic formulation, To reduce something is to take it not from all of its complexity and all of its accoutrements, but just what is the simplest, most reductive way you can describe the thing. Evolutionary reductionism is the idea that you and I are, as it were, in the spectrum of evolving organisms, and we find ourselves happily at the top of that, right? We are the most advanced mammalian species on Earth, right? But what we are going to see is this idea of reducing us down to merely evolved primates actually brings with it a whole host of perhaps unforeseen consequences. That is to say, the loss of personal identity, the loss of character, freedom, what we value as freedom, and so many more things. So let's sort of unpack this, and I'll try to take you on a journey that I think will make a lot of sense. We've already discussed in our series titled 5 Good Reasons, or not our series, but our presentation titled 5 Good Reasons to Believe God Exists. We looked at those 5 reasons that were summarized by these 5 single-syllable words: time, life, mind, ought, and love. The second of those is life. And when we talked about the nature of life, we talked about this man here, Antony Flew. Antony Flew, you might remember, was arguably the world's foremost academic atheist for decades. And then in the very latter part of his life, he changed his perspective, changed his mind, and actually became a believer in God. Not a believer in the Bible as such, or even in the Christian God, but a believer in some kind of intelligent, designing force. There was a book published in 2009, actually it was 2000, maybe a little later than that, 2010 or 11 perhaps, titled "There is a God, How the World's Most Notorious Atheist Changed His Mind." And you might remember that the thing that caused Flew to reconsider his lifelong professional and academic commitments was the code that was contained in DNA. After the discovery of the DNA structure and sequence by Francis Crick and James Watson in the 1960s, this transformed the way that lots of people viewed heritability, how information, how data was passed on from generation to generation to generation. And so, to quote Flew, he said, "What I think the DNA material has done is show that intelligence must have been involved to get these extraordinarily diverse elements together." He continues, "The enormous complexity by which the results were achieved looked to me like the work of intelligence." And you have to have a lot of respect, and you have to give a lot of credit, even if you are not, even if you're not inclined toward Flew's perspective or opinion. You have to give him a lot of credit for being an evidentialist, going where the evidence leads. And he said, "Look, even though I've had a lifelong professional commitment to a certain perspective, when I saw this new information, when I saw the code, the language, the information that's contained in DNA, I changed my mind. I changed my perspective." I think Flew, in following the evidence where it led, even though, again, it was contrary to his prior commitments, was an honest person, following the evidence where it leads. An honest man, says Crick, armed with all the knowledge available to us now, could only state that in some sense, the origin of life appears at the moment to be almost a, what's that word? It looks like a miracle, right? What is miraculous about it, Mr. Crick? So many are the conditions which would have had to have been satisfied to get it going. This enormous complexity that Flew speaks of, he says, it just seems like the work of intelligence. Well, years later, in 1994, Crick would publish this book, The Astonishing Hypothesis, The Scientific Search for the Soul. About 30 years later, after he received the Nobel Prize for his work with DNA, some 30 years later, he published this book, The Astonishing Hypothesis, trying to understand the nature of consciousness. He actually got very interested in the study of the brain and in the study of what he calls here the soul, identity. Can science give us any insights into how we self-perceive, into how we self-identify, right? I think of myself, David Asscherick, as having dreams and hopes and fears and ambitions and desires, right? And you think of yourself similarly. You have a name. You see yourself in a unique way, right? In a way that's fundamentally different from the way that you see those around you. You have private access to your innermost thoughts, to your sense of who you are and what you are. And so Crick and other scientists as well have tried to understand the relationship between science. Can science tell us anything about what exactly we are? Well, the answer is yes, but I think Crick went down a wrong road. I think he took a turn, and we'll talk about the nature of that turn that he took. But let me just share with you a quotation from Crick to this effect. He says, your joys and your sorrows, your memories and ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more. Now that's a key phrase that I've italicized there, and we'll come back to that. Are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. When he says the thing that you perceive as you, your freedom, your identity, the thing that you perceive as the person that you are, he says it's really no more than, that's reductionism. That there's nothing immaterial, there's nothing transcendent, there's nothing, to use a very simple word, spiritual about you. Right? There's nothing particularly mysterious about you. It's just that there's a whole bunch of molecules and there's a whole bunch of an assembly, as he says, of nerve cells located in the brain, and that produces the you that you perceive. Now, no one denies that there is a direct connection between who we perceive ourselves to be and the brain. Of course, no one denies that. But when Crick says you are no more than this, he flatly denies any transcendent or spiritual reality. He's saying you are merely atoms and molecules in motion. That's reductionism, right? Of course, we have already noted that the human brain is by far the most complex thing that we know of in the universe, right? Consisting of some 100 to 200 billion neurons, with every one of those neurons having an average of 7,000 connections, right? The number of potential pathways, neuronal pathways in your brain are greater than the total number of atoms in the universe. Absolutely astonishing. There's nothing that even begins to approximate the complexity of the human brain. And what Crick is saying is, I know you perceive yourself as kind of a special, unique person. And as somebody who, for those of you that are believers, have a spirit and you have a soul. And Crick says, no, hogwash, poppycock, there's nothing to any of it. All you are is a very complicated bundle of nerve cells and their associated molecules. That's all you are. You are no more than that. Reducing the unique and, I would say, wonderful, wild, awesome person that you are down to its basic, this is reductionism, evolutionary reductionism. You are not a special child made and formed and fashioned in the image of God. No, you, the thing that you perceive to be you, is just a very complicated bundle of nerve cells. There are so much that comes along with this, and I'll use an illustration that I've used in the past, and I'll try and tell this story somewhat quickly. I was fishing several years ago with my son, Landon. This is when he was quite a bit younger. He was 6 or 7 years old. And on one occasion, we pulled up just to the place we were about to be. But before I threw the anchor in, I went to the back of the boat to do something. And I heard a splash. And when I turned to look, Landon, as a 6-year-old boy is likely to do, he's emulating his father. He's seen Dad, pull up and grab the anchor and throw it in. Pull up, grab the anchor, and throw it in. And so he's done the same, right? He's done the same. He's emulating his dad. He knows what comes next. We parked the boat. We're going to throw the anchor in. The problem is that, well, number one, he hadn't asked, but number two, he had not done a crucially important thing when you throw an anchor off of a boat, and that's to make sure that there's nothing and no one attached to the rope, right? And in fact, when we had left our last spot, we had thrown our lunch and our fishing rods and our tackle box on top of the rope. So when Landon, voluntarily and nicely, politely chucks the anchor in, it goes kabloop, and I look up from the back of the boat and I can see that as the anchor's going down, as the rope is going, there goes the fishing rod, and there goes the lunch, and there goes the tackle box. And I made it to the front of the boat just in time to lift up Landon because the rope to some degree was wrapped around his own leg. Right? Now here's the point. When we just say, well, we don't need a God, we've got a sufficiently complex brain to explain all of the, wonderful richness of the world, we think, well, this is so nice and easy. We'll just throw God out the window. We don't need him, a lot of people would say. We live in a technologically advanced age. We live in an age where the medieval and ancient ideas of God, we don't need that anymore. We're now advanced, et cetera, et cetera. Here's the problem. When you throw that over, kabloop, God and his existence is attached to lots of other things that are going to go with God. When you throw God out, you cannot maintain your sense of individual personhood, identity, character, the transcendence that we associate with the persons that we are and the persons that our friends and family are. Right? Throwing God out the window is not just as easily as, okay, we got rid of him, now we can live our lives. The point that Crick is making is, in fact, When we boil human beings down, they're just a complicated bundle of nerve cells. That's reductionism. That's throwing God out the window. It's throwing ethics out the window. It's throwing transcendence out the window, getting rid of all of it. Now, this is why this is important. This is well known. This is not just something David Asscherick is saying. This idea of when you throw the anchor out, when you throw God out and you don't pay attention to what it's attached to, you actually end up with a whole series of things that flow as a result of that decision or that action. In 1988, on what's called Darwin Day, longtime professor at Cornell University, who has since recently passed away of a brain tumor, William B. Provine articulated this idea really simply, really easily, and frankly, really scarily, right? And this is what he says. He says, naturalistic evolution has clear consequences that Charles Darwin understood perfectly. Okay? He said, hey, look, Darwin knew what he was saying, and those of us that are in the know, we know what's actually going on here, and Provine is going to tell us, with no shame, with no ambiguity, he's going to tell us what flows when we chuck the anchor of God's existence and God's goodness, we don't need him. What is attached to that rope that we might lose in the process, or that we will lose in the process? Number one, no gods worth having exist. Number two, no life after death exists. Number three, no ultimate foundation for ethics exists. Number four, no ultimate meaning in life exists. And number five, human free will is non-existent. Okay, now let's just take stock here of what's at stake. What's at stake is, number one, there's no God, there's no afterlife, there's no ought or ought not ethics, there's no meaning, and there is no free will, right? The thing that, now you just take all of those things out of life, and from my perspective, you just took the skeleton out of. Now you just have a heap, just a heap of muscle and organs and tissue. There's no structure inside of it, right? Provine says, this is exact. We're sorry to tell you, the news is bad. This is the way that reality works. Well, Provine had that boldness. Peter Atkins goes a step further, a British chemist, goes a step further, a well-known enemy of religion and atheist. He says, science has no need of purpose. All the extraordinary, wonderful richness of the world can be expressed as growth from the dunghill of purposeless, interconnected corruption. Don't you love that? I mean, you got to give him credit for his poetry. It's really well articulated, right? He's like, look, there is no purpose in life. There's no transcendent meaning in life. It's just all the steam coming off the dunghill of purposeless, interconnected corruption. Well, cheers for that, mate, right? Not only no God, no afterlife, no ought or ought not, no meaning, no free will, no wonderful richness of the world, the things that we talked about yesterday. Right? When we were talking about companionship and friendship and love and meaning and blueberries and mangoes and peaches and music and rhythm and melody and harmony, all of that, he says, no, it's a giant dunghill of purposeless interconnection. So what's at stake here has, for me, been really well articulated, and perhaps I've not found a place where what's at stake has been better articulated than by author Randy Alcorn. And I want you to hear the two things, the two opposing realities that are in considerable hostility here and in considerable tension. This is what Alcorn writes. This is option A, option one. You are the descendant of a tiny cell of primordial protoplasm, washed up on an empty beach 3.5 billion years ago. You are the blind and arbitrary product of time and chance and natural forces. You are a mere grab bag of atomic particles, a conglomeration of genetic substance. You exist on a tiny planet in a minute solar system in an empty corner of a meaningless universe. You have no essence beyond your body, and at death you will cease to exist entirely. In short, you came from nothing and are going nowhere. To which Atkins and Crick and Provine would all say, amen. They would all agree. They would say, that's exactly right. That is what flows naturally and necessarily from the great truth that was uncovered in 1858 by Charles Darwin in the publication of On the Origin of Species. This is what we now know. It might be bad news for many of you, but this is the sober scientific truth. Right? Now, as compared with, let Alcorn paint another picture. You are the special creation of a good and all-powerful God. You are created in his image with capacities to think, to feel, to worship that set you above all other life forms. You differ from the animals not simply in degree, but also in kind. Not only is your kind unique, but you are unique among your kind. Your Creator loves you so much and so intensely desires your companionship and affection that He has a perfect plan for your life. In addition, God gave the life of His only Son that you might spend eternity with Him. If you are willing to accept the gift of salvation, you can become a child of God. To which I would say, amen. But here's the point. Do you see how totally hostile these two views of reality are to one another? Right? There's a lot at stake here. Right? It's not simply a matter of affirming adaptation and affirming that at some level species can adapt to, various ecological niches. That's what's at stake, I suppose, at one level. But on a more deeper philosophical level, what's at stake here is, does your life have meaning or not? Does the world have meaning or not? Is there anything transcendent or not? And when we chuck the anchor of God off the boat, some are happy to be done with God, and we don't need Him anymore telling us what to do. We don't need some sort of cosmic police, monitoring me. I am now free. The problem is, as we're going to discover, freedom itself is illusory if all you are is a bundle of very complicated nerve cells called the brain. Let's talk about the nature of that in our second reason. Reason number 2, I'm suggesting here, the second reason to doubt Darwin is that the great truth at the heart of the universe and the heart of reality is love, not selfishness. That there is something going on in the universe, and that something that's going on is love. Now let's unpack this from a biblical perspective, and then we'll jump into some really cool material. We've already noted John chapter 3, verse 16, the best known and most quoted probably verse in all the Bible. For God so loved the world. Not just that He loved, but that He so loved the world. 1 John chapter 4, verse 8, whoever does not love does not know God, because God is love. Those 3 words, those 3 syllables, so pregnant with meaning. God is love. We'll come back to that in just a little bit. And then John 15:13, a passage that we've noted in our series already. Greater love has no one than this, that a man would lay down his life, that one would lay down their life for their friends. This idea of love is really right at the heart of what most of us take for granted in terms of the meaning of life, the significance of life, the importance of life. We noted the things that we just take for granted from the moment we're born. We're just sort of raised up and we have a sense of our own individuality. We perceive that in some way we have private internal access to our nose, to our eyes, to our mouth. We can understand by way of sympathy what somebody else might be thinking, seeing, feeling, or tasting. If I have a really nice piece of a Danish, if I take a bite out of an amazing Danish and I say, oh, this is so good, and I tear you off a bite and say, you can have some, I'm assuming, quite without any actual evidence, that your experience will be analogous to mine. In fact, I'm hoping that your experience will be identical to mine. And when you take a bite of that Danish and say, wow, this is absolutely amazing, we're actually taking a step or even a leap in faith. I'm assuming that you are having an experience that's similar to mine, but I have no way of knowing that. I can't taste through your mouth, I can't smell through your nose, I can't see through your eyes. So we, from a very young age, perceive that we are, as it were, viewing the movie through our camera. And sometimes we can be really selfish with this. In fact, children, I think, are born with an innate selfishness where everybody else is like playing a part in the movie that they're a star of. Right? And that's the way that many human beings, even adults, perceive the world, right? This is my movie, I'm the star, and everybody else is like a bit player in the movie that is all about David Asscherick. Okay? But as we mature and as we grow, and especially as we become followers of Jesus, we realize that everybody else's reality is just as real and important to them as your reality is to you. Well, this creates empathy, this creates sympathy, this begins to create a larger network of understanding where it's not just all about me, it can be about you and you and you and you, and if you're looking out for me and I'm looking out for you, this creates a collective us. Right? It creates a collective us. And so things like individuality and freedom and love and risk and meaning are things that the vast majority of us just take for granted. But then here come the Cricks and the Provines and the ATKINS of the world that are saying to us, actually no. Actually no. All of that is illusory. All of that is just sleight of hand. It appears that the world has meaning and significance and transcendence and even some spirituality. But in fact, it does not. Michael Roos, another atheist and scientist, says ethics, to ought, to behave in certain ways, should, ought, morally responsible behavior, He says ethics, as we understand it, is an illusion. An illusion. It's illusory. It's not real. It is an illusion fobbed off on us by our genes to get us to cooperate. Now, this is a very interesting idea. Are there ways that we should be behaving, and by extension, ways that we should not be behaving? And Ruth says no. That whole sense of morality, that sense of right and wrong, ways that are appropriate to behave and responsible to behave, and ways that are not appropriate and responsible to behave, he says that is an illusion that's been fobbed off onto your complicated bundle of nerve cells called a brain by your genes. This gene-centric view of evolution was probably made popular in a 1976 book published by, or written by Richard Dawkins. Richard Dawkins is probably the best-known atheist today, a popularizer of atheism today, wrote The God Delusion and other books like that. But prior to writing The God Delusion, which is a more modern work of Dawkins, in 1976, he wrote a book called The Selfish Gene. And what The Selfish Gene was a book that described moving away from a sort of group perspective on evolution or an individual's perspective on evolution to a gene-centered perspective on evolution. And it basically goes like this. You are, as it were, a kind of carrier for the larger thing of significance in the world, and that's your genes, right? The title gives it away, the selfish gene. That whether you're an alligator or you're a giraffe or a human being, the point here is that your genes are trying to propagate themselves. It's not about Ray, and it's not about Pete, and it's not about David, and it's not about Judith. It's really about your genes that are trying to propagate themselves, and you were, as it were, merely a host that are being somewhat parasitized by the genes that are just trying to self-replicate, right? That are being selfish. And so, for example, Dawkins says here, and listen carefully for the reductionism. I've italicized it so you won't miss it, but just pay attention to it. Dawkins writes, the universe is nothing but. That's reductionism. It's nothing but a collection of atoms in motion. Human beings are simply machines for propagating DNA. Right? That's all that we are. He continues, the propagation of DNA is a self-sustaining process, whether it happens with a crocodile, a giraffe, a cheetah, or a human. It's a self-sustaining process. It is every living object's sole reason for living. So when you see phrases like no more, sole reason, and nothing but, those phrases are cues to you that life is being reduced down to its most basic evolutionary reductionism. That you are not what you perceive yourself to be. You are not what you've been told by the Bible. You're not what you've been told by your parents and your pastor. In fact, you are a machine for the replication of selfish genes. You're nothing but that. And so what we have here is this radical hostility between totally antithetical versions of reality. One version of reality says, no, the core of reality, the most fundamental truth in the universe is love. God is love. He's the first being. He is the uncaused cause of all subsequent causes. He is the unmoved mover. He is the uncreated. And God, in his very essence, is love. That's what one version says. And because God loved, he gave his only begotten Son. Because God loved, he laid down his life. That's what's at the core of reality is love. And here's this other version of reality that says there is no God, and at the core of reality is selfishness, self-centeredness. These are radically different ideas, fundamentally different ideas. And not just different, but they are antithetical. Think of it as painting a picture with two very different color palettes. Right here, you have a canvas, a blank canvas, and the colors that you have available to you are all of the various beautiful colors, the greens and the reds and the blues and the yellows and the oranges and all of those, and you're painting this picture. And over here, all of the colors that are available to you are in the monochromatic grayscale. You have black and you have white and you have grays. There are no colors. There is no tapestry of various hues. There's just variations on black and white, right? And so you're going to paint two very different pictures. Not to say that you couldn't paint a beautiful picture and various monochromatic. Of course you could, but these are going to be different pictures, and that's the point. Over here, you have love, and you have meaning, and you have hope, and you have significance, and you have God, and you have salvation, and you have Scripture, all of that. You have all of these colors available to you. Over here, the color that you have available to you is basically black and white and some shades of gray, because all that the universe is just matter in motion. All you are is matter in motion. All your spouse is matter in motion. The love that you feel for your spouse or for your children or for your parents is merely a neurochemical transaction that's taking place in a very complex bundle of nerve cells located in your skull. Right? This is reductionism. This is taking reality as the vast majority of us know it, understand it, and love it, and reducing it down to its lowest common denominator. And yet, over and against this, are passages, beautiful, poetic, profoundly insightful passages that I believe are intuitively true. And we just sense that that's the way life is. Life is like that, or at least life should be like that. Passages like 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verses 4 and 5, sometimes known as the love chapter, where Paul gives this amazing insight, this poetic insight into what love is and what love isn't. He says love is patient, love is kind, it does not envy, it does not boast, it is not proud, it does not dishonor others. And notice what I've italicized here. It is not self-seeking. In these two competing versions of reality, we have a selfless center of reality, God is love, and here we have a selfish view of reality in terms of the biological reality. You are merely a machine for the propagation of selfish genes. Right? And yet love, it says here, does not seek its own. It is not easily angered. It keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices in the truth. Love always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. What a beautiful picture, but let's just take this a step further. When Paul comes to the end of the love chapter there in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, he says, and now these three remain, faith, hope, and love, but the greatest of these is love. The greatest, most fundamental reality in the universe, he says, is love. Well, of course, because God is love. And if God is the uncaused cause, if God is the unmoved mover, if God is the great I am, if he is the most fundamental thing in all of reality as the creator, and we are all operating in relationship to him as the created, well, if this is the way that reality is, we can do a really cool thing. If God is love and love is all of those things, we can substitute the word God in that beautiful poetic description that Paul gives us in 1 Corinthians 13, and a picture emerges. A fantastic, beautiful, sublime picture emerges. Take a look at it here. God is patient. Notice we've substituted God for the word love here, just to give us a feel for the shape of the kind of person that God is, his character, his essential nature. God is patient. God is kind. He does not envy. He does not boast. He does not dishonor others, and he is not self-seeking. Key. He's looking out for the blessing, benefit, joy, happiness of others. He does not dishonor others, is not self-seeking. He is not easily angered, and he keeps no record of wrongs. God does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. He always protects, always trusts, always hopes, and always perseveres. Friends, if that is true, and I love to hear those amens there, because if this is true, and I think that all of us here in this room, and I think a great many people outside of this room, have a sense that at least if reality isn't this way, they want it to be this way. Now again, we don't get to choose what the nature of reality is. We don't get to just decide what the universal narrative is. But I'm going to present to you evidence as we continue in our series here that this is not just the way we want reality to be. It is the way it is. God as a selfless, fully other-centered, loving being is the greatest truth in all of the universe. As we noted yesterday, the best possible good news is that number one, there is a God, and number two, he looks like Jesus. You cannot conceive of better good news than that reality at its core is not just a monochromatic of some black, some white, and a few grays, but it's a rich tapestry of colors and hues and meaning and joy and forgiveness and mercy and kindness and love and acceptance. All of these colors that are available to us if the scriptural record is to be believed. And so we move to our third reason, which we transition from a theological perspective on the nature of love and selfishness to a more scientific one. One of the reasons that many people historically have doubted Darwin, and that some continue to do so, is because the fossil record is not easily harmonized with gradualism. Gradualism, the idea that we move through the fossil record, right, from less complex orders of creature to increasingly complex to more and more complex and to finally us. Here we are on top of the earth, right? And yet, while many of us have perhaps been to the Grand Canyon, I myself have been there, and there is a certain appeal, there is a certain logic to it. Yeah, that kind of makes sense. In fact, when you dig a little deeper, it's very difficult to harmonize gradualism with the fossil record. A man by the name of Stephen Meyer in 2009 wrote a book called Signature in the Cell: DNA and the Evidence for Intelligent Design, following up on the material that we talked about, some of that same material with Antony Flew, that it looks like the work of intelligence. We've already noted that the nature of DNA is that it contains a code, much like this treble clef and this music staff and this eighth note are a code telling you that's the note A, and this is how long you play it, right? And so those of us that can read music, we look at that and we say, oh yes, of course. Those that can't read music, it's just a bunch of scribbles and lines. They know it has meaning, but they don't themselves know what the meaning is. So too with the Chinese symbol of life, right? If you know what that means, you look at it and you just make the transition seamlessly, as easily as you and I make the transition from the letters L-I-F-E. We look at it, we say life. We not only make that transition seamlessly, you can't not make that transition. Once you've learned to read, you can't not read, right? And so we understand that symbols convey meaning because a code has been put into them. But in 2013, Meyer, who wrote Signature in the Cell, wrote a second book titled Darwin's Doubt. And the subtitle's a little hard to read, but I'll read it for you. The Explosive Origin of Animal Life and the Case for Intelligent Design. Now listen to that language, sometimes called ID. Intelligent design. That there is a designer, and it's not just random mutation and natural selection designing through a non-superintended process, but there's an intelligent, purposeful designer. And so, Darwin's doubt. Here's Meyer, and he says, popular defenses of the theory of evolution continue apace, rarely if ever acknowledging the growing body of critical scientific opinion about the standing of the theory. We'll come back to that at the end. He says there's a growing body of critiques about the theory of evolution, but notice what he says here. He says, rarely has there been such a great disparity, such a great difference between the popular perception of a theory and its actual standing in the relevant peer-reviewed scientific literature. One of the points that Meyer makes in the book, and I read the book probably 2 or 3 years ago, is that when you actually get into the peer-reviewed articles on the nature of especially what's called the Cambrian explosion, which is in the bottommost level of the geologic column, all of a sudden life just shows up. And a complicated life, extraordinary life, different organisms that have been fossilized that are very complicated. I mean, by any metric, things like trilobites and nautilus and fascinating creatures, and they just show up. And then you go below that Cambrian rock into the pre-Cambrian rock, and there's nothing. It's just a vast wasteland, as it were. But as soon as you get to the Cambrian layer, there's this an explosion of life. And he says there's a growing number of people that are saying, yeah, that's hard to explain because, as Meyer points out, and as many others have pointed out, the fossil record is basically characterized by two things. Number one, the sudden appearance of life, what we're calling here the Cambrian explosion. Right? That all of a sudden, fully formed, very complex organisms just show up. And then number two, what we might call biological stasis. That is to say that when we find, say, a horse or a whale or some creature fossilized in the fossil record, we see them and they remain more or less what they are for the whole duration of their appearance in the fossil record, and then they disappear. Right? We don't see, as you would expect, these what are called transitional species that are sort of half this and half that and part this and part that. No. When we find a horse in the fossil record, we can tell it's a horse. And when we find a dog in the fossil record, you say, that's a dog. And you find a whale, and you say, that's a whale. Sometimes they are different than the current species that we have today, but we can look at them and say, we know what that is. And these transitional species are not so much there. What we see is stasis. Now, for these reasons, a number of paleontologists like Mark McMenamin have actually suggested that we need to come up with another theory for the evolution and the creation of all of these various creatures that are embedded in the fossil layers. He says, it's hard for us paleontologists, steeped as we are in the tradition of Darwinian analysis, to admit that neo-Darwinian explanations for the Cambrian explosion have failed miserably. So when we've been steeped in a certain way of understanding and seeing things, when you've been trained to see things in a certain way, he says it's difficult to see them in another way. He says, but the more information we get, the harder it gets. New data acquired in recent years, instead of solving Darwin's dilemma, have rather made it worse. Meyer describes the dimensions of this problem with clarity and precision. His book is a game changer for the study of evolution and points us in the right direction as we seek a new theory for the origin of animals. Now, Mark McMenamin is a scientist. He's a paleontologist. He's not coming from a biblical, he's not saying, well, the Bible says, he's not a fundamentalist. What he's saying is that the scientific theory that has been proposed and largely believed for the last 100+ years is getting harder to believe given the evidence that is accumulating. Meyer says the same thing. He says there's a growing, and we're going to get to this in our fifth and final point, there's a growing body of critique about the Darwinian theory and about its ability to explain all of the wonderful richness of the world that we see around us. Which brings us to reason number 4. There is a crucial and essential difference that we understand between science and scientism. Science is a noble pursuit, right? Science is simply trying to tell us more about the world in which we find ourselves. Right? Science proceeds on demonstrability, observability, falsifiability, and repeatability. It proceeds on, as we all probably in school performed various scientific experiments. And if we did our experiment right, and the people that were next to us, if they did the same experiment, we would have gotten similar or perhaps even identical outcomes. Science then observes, it makes hypotheses, it tries to better understand the world around us. Right? This is great stuff. To better understand the world around us. Nothing wrong with science. It is a noble and wonderful pursuit. Okay? It's a beautiful thing, an absolutely beautiful thing. But scientism is like a quasi-religion that answers to the name of science. And I'm going to try to paint a picture here between the difference between science as a noble academic pursuit and scientism. Just a few weeks ago, I actually came across this article titled Scientific Regress in the online journal First Things. The problem with science is that so much of it isn't. And he talks about, in the article, the difference between scientism, which we bring our own, the scientists are human beings too. Right? They don't get a free pass to objectivity. They don't get a free pass to, being unbiased and unprejudiced about the, desired outcomes of an experiment. No, we all, just as we are all biased in our own, idiosyncratic ways, scientists are too. And he goes through there and demonstrates how all of these instances where scientific findings could not be repeated, even though they had been reported in reputed scientific journals. And there's just many instances of this where things that have been reported and then quoted on, quotes on quotes on quotes on quotes, and then these fact-checking, a group of, graduate students in various and sundry universities go back and they try to replicate these experiments. I mean, to a T, identical, using same methodology, same everything, and they get radically different outcomes. And it's just like, well, what's going on here? Is that they got the methodology wrong? No, they traced the methodology exactly as the original experiment had done it. And the answer is, he makes this point, and there's a couple of fascinating books that have been written on this that I want to read, how we bring our own prejudices, whether we know them or not, to desired outcomes. In the same way that we hear a story and we incline ourselves to understand a story in a way that probably best benefits us, we view the world through the skew of our own perspective and outlook. And scientists are not immune to this, which is why Wilson calls the article Scientific Regress. This is how he closes the article. Fascinating. Very pointed, very biting in his critique of scientism. He says, when cultural trends attempt to render science a sort of religionless clericalism, scientists are apt to forget that they are made of the same crooked timber as the rest of humanity, and they will necessarily imperil the work that they do. The greatest friends of the cult of science are the worst enemies of science's actual practice. He makes a very important distinction that I'm making here with you today between the ideology of scientism, which is really a philosophy based on a way that we want to see and perceive the world, and the actual study of science, which asks questions about the nature of reality and why things are the way they are. Why do those birds migrate then? Why there? Why at this time of the year? Why? These are all legitimate questions, and we should applaud those people that give themselves to these various questions. The vast, vast, vast majority of scientists, I am persuaded, are not even aware of the philosophical issues at stake, right? Not that they're unintelligent, but many of them, I mean, if you're studying storm petrels on a remote Pacific atoll, you're not thinking about the nature of science. You're measuring eggs. You're, charting behavior. You're attaching radio transmitters. This is the vast majority of what many scientists in the world are doing. But philosophers of science and professors of science are infusing an ideology that basically says you are no more than a collection of molecules and associated nerve fibers and associated molecules. Well, that's a philosophical statement. Nobody ever got into a laboratory, put the Bunsen burner on the stove, heated it up, and came away with the conclusion that life was meaningless. It's like, yep, we heated the water up to whatever the temperature was, and we put in the chemical, and we found out that life was meaningless and there is no God. Okay, that doesn't happen. That's an ideology that has been imported by people like Provine and Crick and others. That's scientism. It's the difference between science and scientism. We've quoted Plantinga before, and we've quoted him as that great quotation that Christianity is not only the Christian story is not only the greatest story ever told, the greatest story that ever could be told. Well, in 2011, published by Oxford University Press, I actually brought the book. I brought several of my favorite books on this topic because I thought some of you might want to come up and look at them afterward. But in 2011, Plantinga wrote this book. He's written many books, several of which I've read, but he wrote this book published by Oxford University Press titled Where the Conflict Really Lies: Science, Religion, and Naturalism. Fascinating, absolutely amazing book. I've read through large parts of it several times. Now, this is how the opening sentence of the book begins, right? This is what Plantinga says, who himself is a committed Christian and also arguably one of the greatest analytical philosophers on the planet today. This is how Plantinga opens his book, Where the Conflict Really Lies. He says, here's my overall claim in this book. Okay, this is the point I'm going to make. There is superficial conflict, but deep concord, deep agreement between science and theistic religion. Between science and religion, but there is superficial concord or agreement, but deep conflict between science and materialism. He's raising the point that the lines that Provine and Crick and others have said about, there's just nothing out there, there's nothing in the universe of any significance or substance, any transcendent substance. He says, actually, that is not the foundation upon which true science is built. He continues, there is superficial concord between science and naturalism, if only because so many naturalists trumpet the claim that science is a pillar in the temple of naturalism. As I argue, they are mistaken. One cannot rationally accept both naturalism and current evolutionary theory. He says one cannot rationally accept both naturalism, that is that the world in its most basic reductive sense is just matter in motion, and current evolutionary theory. He says this combination of beliefs is self-defeating. And you're like, why? Why so? Well, you'd have to read the whole book to get the answer. But the short answer is that it undermines rationality. Rationality proceeds on the assumption that there is a mind, there is an intellect, that there is deductive reasoning, but if all that's happening is just the chattering of synapses and neurons in your brain, this is not rational and it's not scientific. He continues, given that naturalism is at least a quasi-religion, there is indeed a science-religion conflict, all right, but it is not between science and religion, theistic religion, it is between science and naturalism, the closing line of his book. That's where the conflict really lies. Yeah, there is a conflict here, but the conflict is not between science and religion. The conflict is between science and an ideology that we might call scientism, which undermines rationality. And there have been a lot of people that are pushing back on scientism, including people like John Polkinghorne. John Polkinghorne is a theoretical physicist and also an Anglican priest, and an amazing, extraordinary human being who has criticized this reductionistic view of life. And I'll just give you a quotation here that I love. Scientism destroys rationality. Hey, that's what Plantinga just said. Scientism destroys rationality. Thought is replaced by electrochemical neural events. Two such events cannot confront each other in rational discourse. They are neither wrong nor right. There is no ought. They simply happen. Notice what Polkinghorne says here. He says, those assertions by the reductionist himself are nothing but blips in the brain. The world of rational discourse dissolves into the absurd chatter of firing synapses. And then I love this. He says, quite frankly, that cannot be right, and none of us believes it to be so. That's just absurd, he says. When I sit down to have a conversation with Rochelle and we're talking about something of significance, we're talking about anything, we are operating under the assumption that we are engaging in a conversation, a rational discourse between two human beings. Two minds are having a meeting, what we call a meeting of the minds. Polkinghorne says, if all you are is a brain and an assembly of very complex nerve cells, that's not what's happening. What's happening is that there is no such thing as rationality. And so at its most fundamental level, the conflict is not between religion and science. It's between science and scientism, which is an ideologically driven view of the world. And then finally, for these reasons and others, the number of doubters of Darwin and of his evolutionary model is growing. I recently became aware of a website titled Descent from Darwin. Descent from Darwin, fascinating here. Over the last several years, this website has accumulated more than 1,000 names of people who have, you can only sign this document if you have a PhD in like biology or one of the primary sciences, mathematics. You have to be a top PhD level person in, there's just certain disciplines. In other words, it can't be like in philosophy or theology or something like that. It has to be a scientific PhD in order to sign this. And more than 1,000 people have signed this. And this is what they're signing on to. The statement is right here. I'll read it for you. We are skeptical of claims for the ability of random mutation and natural selection, that's Darwinian evolution, to account for the complexity of life. Careful examination of the evidence for Darwinian theory should be encouraged. That's it. They say, we just think that we should do some more study, some more research, and look into this and not just assume that this ideology that's being crammed down our throats is necessarily true. Now, of course, 1,000 or 1,100 or 1,200, the number is growing every day. The number of scientists that sign this, of course, that is a fraction of the total number of scientists in the world. But here's the point. The point is that these are people who are aware of the scientific matters at stake. These are people in their various areas of discipline, whether it's in chemistry or biology or molecular biology, who are saying, hey, wait a minute, that doesn't work in my field of expertise. That doesn't work here in my particular field of expertise. And these people are raising not theological objections to Darwinism, not philosophical objections to Darwinism, but they're raising evidence-based, science-based objections and saying there are reasons to doubt Darwin. In fact, one of the chapters in where the conflict really lies in Plantinga's book is Darwin's doubts, describing that Darwin himself had doubts about his own theory and the viability of that theory. One of my favorite authors on this subject, on the nature of science and the nature of evolution, is David Berlinski, and I'll leave you with this quotation from him. He says, for many years, biologists have succeeded in keeping skepticism on the circumference of evolutionary thought, where paleontologists, taxonomists, and philosophers linger. Those have been the critics, he says, of Darwin. But the burning fringe of criticism is now contracting, coming ever closer to the heart of Darwin's doctrine. That is to say, biology, microbiology, chemistry. Questions are being raised. There's a growing number of dissenting voices, and thus the title of the website, Descent from Darwin. Now here's just a few resources. If you want to take a picture of this with your phone, it's probably a good list of resources to get started from, not from a really advanced level. I've read dozens and dozens of books on this subject, on these subjects, and this is just a good orientation, a good place to get started. Evolution Impossible by my good friend Dr. John Ashton. Also, he compiled a book of 50 PhD level scientists describing why they believe in a literal six-day creation and a young earth titled In 6 Days. A really cool book by a long-time Cornell professor who became a follower of Jesus and started seeing all of the research, the scientific research that he had done, actually supporting a biblical view of origins titled Genetic Entropy, a fascinating book by John Sanford. Darwin's Black Box by Michael J. Behe. Behe's written a brand new book called Darwin Devolves. I've not read that yet, but looking forward to it. Darwin on Trial by Philip E. Johnson. Johnson also wrote a really great book called Defeating Darwinism by Opening Minds. Anything by Johnson on the subject of Darwinism will be outstanding. A really good website that's run by a friend of mine named Dr. Sean Pittman titled DetectingDesign.com. And then finally, the Discovery Institute at discovery.org is also a great resource. So just to review the material that we've covered here today, what are the good reasons for doubting Darwinism? Reason number one, because evolutionary reductionism, as we've discussed, undermines identity, character, freedom, and so much more. When you chuck the anchor of God off the boat, a whole lot of other stuff goes with it, including stuff that you and I take absolutely for granted. Notice I've skipped to reason number three because I want to end on reason number two. Reason number three, the fossil record is not easily harmonized with gradualism, with Darwinian evolution. Reason number four, there is a crucial difference between science and scientism. Reason number five, there's a growing number of doubters. And not doubters like me, lay people in the scientific enterprise, but scientists themselves who are raising their hand and saying, I think this theory requires more research. It requires more scrutiny. And I want to end on number two. The great truth at the heart of the universe and of reality is love, not selfishness. This idea as described in 1 John chapter 4, verse 8, he who does not love does not know God, for God is love. Whether or not, you basically have two competing views, as we looked in those amazing quotations from Randy Alcorn. You got two views here. One, you get to paint with all of the colors and the hues of a rich tapestry of colors and shades, and all of that's available to you. In the other, you basically get to paint with black and white and a few grays, because all that you have at your disposal is matter and energy and molecules, and that's it. You have to sort of choose in your innermost soul what version of reality, as you're raising your children, as you're trying to be a good husband or a good wife, what version of reality squares with how you're perceiving the world around you. This is too important a question to leave it to the experts, right? This is something you have to engage with yourself. You have to think yourself. You can't just say, well, I'm not a scientist, I'm not a biochemist, I'm not a biologist, I'm not a physicist. No. You yourself can observe the reality around you. You can become aware of the things that matter most in your own life. You can become aware of Scripture and of God's voice to your own heart. And God will reveal to you who He is and what He is. And Scripture declares in the plainest possible language that God is love. These are 5 good reasons to doubt Darwin.